Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on the critical path method, Part 1. This lesson covers key concepts and techniques of the critical path method, including the activity list and logical relationships, durations, precedence diagrams, forward and backward passes, calculating free float and total float, and finally, of course, calculating the critical path. We also provide a number of examples. The critical path is defined as the sequence of activities that represents the longest path through a project, which determines the shortest possible duration of that project. In other words, of all the different paths through the project from one activity to the next, that path that is the longest in duration is the critical path. The critical path method focuses on calculating the minimum project duration, and this is important, ignores any resource limitations. Resource limitations are factored in later, after you've gone through the critical path method. Let's start with a simple example. Here we have a list of activities, their durations, the predecessor activities, and the relationships between these activities and their predecessors. Activity A has no predecessor. Neither does activity D. Activity A has a duration of 2 days. D has a duration of 3 days. B has a duration of 3 days and a predecessor of A, so A has to happen before B. The relationship is finish to start plus 1, which means that A must finish before B can start, and there's a 1-day lag, so B starts 1 day after A ends. Activity C lasts for 4 days, and activity B must be done before it. Notice that it doesn't show any sort of relationship. When there's no relationship shown, it's assumed or understood that it's a traditional finish to start relationship, which is the most common type of relationship. C also has E as a predecessor, so E must be done before C. D is 3 days long with no predecessors. E is 5 days long with D as a predecessor. And F is 6 days long, and E has to happen before F. The first step in the critical path method is to take all of these activities and draw them out into a network diagram and put them in their proper order with all of the arrows connected as they should be. Activities A and D have no predecessor, so they're the first ones that start off this project and are connected to the start. Then we have activity B following A with a 1-day lag. Activity E below that follows D. Then we have activity C, which has both B and E as a predecessor. And then activity F, which has only activity E as a predecessor. And that's all of the activities. And so those last two connect to the finish. Now that we have all of these activities connected together appropriately, the next step is to add the durations. You'll see that each of these activities is in a box of boxes, and we'll be filling in all of these other boxes as we go. But the first one to fill in is the duration, and that goes in at the top. So here you see activity A, that is duration 2, has a 2 above it. B has a 3 above it, and so on for all of the activities. Here's the legend for this box of boxes. In the middle, you have the activity name. Right above it, as we've seen, is the duration, abbreviated DUR here. In the upper left-hand corner, you have ES, which stands for early start. This is the soonest that this activity could start. EF in the upper right-hand corner stands for early finish. This is the earliest that this activity could finish. Now, along the bottom, you have in the lower left-hand corner, LS for late start, which is the latest that this activity could start. Over in the lower right-hand corner, we have LF, which is the late finish, which is the latest that this activity can finish. And then on the bottom in the middle, we have TF, which is the total float. And we'll get to that definition later. Now we do the forward pass. With the forward pass, we go left to right, and for each activity, we add the early start and early end dates. For activity A, the earliest it could start is on day 1. Sometimes people start with day 0, but most often we use day 1. So starting on day 1, the activity takes 2 days, and so it'll finish at the end of day 2. So a 2 goes in the upper right for the early finish. Then we have activity B, which comes after activity A. It would normally start on the beginning of day 3, but here we have an FS plus 1, which means we have a 1-day lag. And so the earliest that activity B can start is on day 4, 1 day lag between the end of activity A and activity B. Since activity B takes 3 days, it will finish at the end of day 6. Activity C, well, we'll come back to that because it's got multiple dependencies, multiple prerequisites or predecessors. Let's go back over to the left to activity D. It also starts on day 1, lasts 3 days, so it will end at the end of day 3. Activity E starts at the beginning of day 4, lasts 5 days, and so it will end at the end of day 8. Be careful here, as you've noticed, you don't just add the start date plus the duration to come up with the end date. You actually have to subtract one. But trying to remember that formula can be a little confusing. Just think it through here and think of it as starting at the beginning of the day on the left and ending at the end of the day on the right. In this case, on activity A, you've got day 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for 5 days worth of activity E. Then activity F is very straightforward. It starts at the beginning of day 9, lasts for 6 days, and ends at the end of day 14. Activity C could start on day 7, except for the fact that it has to wait until after activity E as well. So the soonest it can start is the beginning of day 9. It lasts 4 days, and so it goes through the end of day 12 before it's finished. And that's the forward pass. Here's a quick review of our box of boxes. We have our activity, and now we have filled in the top row, the early start and early finish based on the duration. Now it's time to go through and do the backward pass and fill in the bottom row. Now for the backward pass, we start on the right and move to the left. We start with the finish and move back to the start. Looking at this finish, we see that we have early finish dates for C and F of 12 and 14 days. That tells us that because activity F can't finish any earlier than the 14th day, you've got a little bit more time to finish activity C. So C doesn't have to finish on day 12. It could finish as late as day 14 and still not delay the project. And so you fill in a 14 there for the late finish in the lower right-hand corner for activity C. You put that same 14 in the bottom right corner of activity F. Now you work your way backwards. With activity C, it takes 4 days, so the late start for activity C is day 11. Looking at activity F, because it lasts for 6 days, count back from your 14, that gives you day 9 is the late start for activity F. So notice activity F doesn't have any leeway. It's early start and late start are the same. Its late finish and early finish are the same. So that one has no slack to it, no buffer. Activity C, on the other hand, has a couple of days worth of leeway that you can play with in your schedule. You keep doing this process moving backwards from right to left. Look at activity B. It can end as late as day 10 without delaying activity C. That means that its late start is 3 days prior or the beginning of day 8. For activity A, this would be a 7 except for that 1 day lag, so it needs to be a 6 as its late finish, and its late start is 2 days prior or the beginning of day 5. So it doesn't have to start on day 1, it could start as late as day 5. Coming back to activity E, what's the latest that it can start? Here's where it gets a little tricky. Activity E could end as late as day 10 without delaying activity C at all. However, it would delay activity F if you did that. So in order to not delay activity F, the latest it can finish is the end of day 8. So that's what you record in the lower right-hand corner. Because it lasts for 5 days, the late start on activity E is day 4. Same thing for activity D. It could end as late as day 3, and it could start as late as day 1. Now it's time to define float. There are 2 types of float, free float and total float. Free float is the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed without delaying the early start date of any successor or violating any other schedule constraint. In other words, how much could this activity slip without delaying the next activity or activities in the schedule? That's the amount of free float. The total float is the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed or extended from its early start date without delaying the project's finish date or violating some other scheduling constraint. In other words, total float will allow you to push other activities later in the project and have those slide as well, as long as it doesn't delay the final end date of the project. You can calculate these, but it's important to understand the concepts. If you understand the concepts, you may not even need the formulas. But the formulas are, for free float, the early start of the next activity minus the early finish of this activity. The total float is the late finish of this activity minus the early finish of this activity. Or you can also do the math by subtracting the late and early start dates. Let's apply free float to this example that we have. Free float is how much an activity can slide without delaying the next activity or activities. Let's take a look at activity A. Could activity A slip without affecting activity B? Using the formula, you have 4 minus 2 minus 1 minus another 1 because of the lag, which gives you 0 free float. Now let's look at B and C. The difference here is that B could end as early as the end of day 6, and activity C can't start until the beginning of day 9. So you can see there is some float here. That 6 could be an 8 without delaying activity C. That alone tells you you've got a couple of days float. Or you can use the formula and say 9 minus 6 minus 1 more, and that gives you your 2 days. Now take a look at activity C. With activity C, you have an early finish of day 12, whereas activity F has an early finish of day 14, which drives your finish date. C and F aren't directly connected, but they're both connected to the finish. So C could slide 2 days without delaying the finish date. So C has a free float of 2. Now, as you look at activity D, you'll see that there's no leeway here at all. There's no free float there. Activity E, that can't slide, or it's going to slip activity C or F. And activity F is already finishing on day 14, which is driving the whole end date of this project. So F can't slide at all. So it has no free float either. Although you need to understand the concept of free float, it isn't actually recorded in your critical path method diagram. Instead, we store total float in that last box on the bottom. Let's do that now with our example. If you take a look at activity C, it can be delayed up to 2 days without delaying the overall project. So a 2 goes in there. Activity B, how much can that be delayed? Now remember, it's not just the free float, but it's all of the total float along the whole line. So C can slide 2 days. B can slide 2 days without affecting C, but also those other 2 days. If C moves by 2, then B can move by 4 without delaying the finish date. And the same holds true for activity A. It can also slide up to 4 days without pushing B and C so far that it delays your project. Now let's look at the bottom row here. Activity F can't delay at all, so we have a 0 there. Activity E can't be delayed because it would push activity F, so that's also a 0 float. And then activity D is in the same situation. It can't slide at all without affecting E and F and the finish date. This whole top row has some total float in those activities, but the bottom row doesn't have any total float at all. Again, you can use the formula here to check these. However, it's best not to rely too much on these formulas because it can be easy to forget them. But in this case, it's pretty simple. You can apply the rule and see that the late finish and early finish are the right-hand side, the upper and lower parts of the right-hand side. For that bottom row, they're the same. You've got 3s, 8s, and 14s there. That tells you, and you can use this as a check, that you have no float, no total float along that line. And along the top, you can check there and see that you've got 6 minus 2, which gives you 4 days of total float on activity A, as well as B and C. There are 3 possible paths through this project. The first is across the top, going from activity A to B to C. The second is across the bottom, activity D, E, and then F. The third is starting at the bottom and then going up to the top, D, E, and C. So these are the 3 paths through this network diagram. As you take a look at these 3 different paths, we're interested in finding out which is the critical path, that path that will determine how long the project is, that path that determines the minimum duration of the project. As you look at these paths, you can see that the path A, B, and C has some slack or float in it, as we've figured out. So there's some leeway there. So that's not the critical path. And neither is D, E, and C, because again, you've got some gap between E and C. And so C can slide a little bit. But the third path of D, E, F across the bottom is the one that has activities that can't move at all without affecting the finish date. You can see from these activities and our calculation of total float that each of these activities have total float of 0. And so this entire path of DEF has total float of 0, which is one of the definitions of the critical path. Now, sometimes the total float isn't 0, but only if there's something else constraining the project. So, for example, suppose there's some other milestone that's imposed on this, some deadline of sorts, or some imposed start date for activity F, for example. That activity F may be constrained so that it can't start until a day or two later, but it's still the critical path. Now let's take a look at another example that's a little bit different. It also has activities A through F. The predecessor relationships are slightly different and with different relationships, and the durations are slightly changed. Activity A with a duration of 2, B with a duration of 3, C with 4, and so on. The predecessors are just a bit different. You'll notice in this case that the relationship between A and B is a finish to start, which is your typical sort of relationship, but it's a +5 this time. And there's a relationship between C and F now that is a start to start relationship. Let's see how this fills in on the network diagram. The network diagram is similar in this example to what we had in the previous example. We can fill in the activities A, B, C, D, E, and F based on their predecessor relationships. A has to happen before B, and we have the finish to start +5 on the arrow. That shows this dependency between A and B, that A must finish, and B can't start until 5 days after A finishes. Then B has to finish before C. Activity D has no predecessor, so it starts at the beginning as A does. E follows D, and F follows E. Notice that we have a new relationship here represented between F and C. If you look up at the table, C has F as a predecessor with a start-to-start relationship. And so we've drawn an arrow here showing that F and C are connected with this arrow. And notice the direction of the arrow is from F to C, because F is listed as a predecessor to C. The arrow goes in this direction from F to C. What about this relationship between activity F and activity C? They're not showing as starting on the same day. One starts on day 8 and one starts on day 11. Isn't that a problem? Isn't this a start-to-start relationship? Actually, it's not a problem, because a start-to-start relationship is defined as one in which the successor activity cannot begin until the predecessor has begun. C cannot start until F starts, but it doesn't say that C has to start when F starts. This is why it's important to get the direction of the arrow correct, so you know which is the predecessor and which is the successor that can start later. In this example, there's no need to make an adjustment to activity C to have it start any later, because it's already starting after activity F starts. And that's it for part 1. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.